Kia ora everyone, welcome to this webinar today on a very cloudy morning in Auckland. I am Nadine France, I'm the Marketing Manager at Toitū Envirocare, and thanks so much for being here today. So firstly, I'd like to hand over to Pratima in Hong Kong. She is the CDP Regional Director for Asia Pacific and is going to share her insights into the green recovery and data transparency across the region. Thanks, Pratima.
I think for those of you, I'd just like to start with, for those of you that are not very familiar with CDP and what we do, we are a UK headquartered not-for-profit, and the idea is really to gather climate data from corporates and then pass them on to investors. Primarily, that's how we started at least. And the idea is then investors can use this information while engaging with companies, but also better understand how companies are building operational resiliency around climate vulnerabilities. In 2011, we also started gathering data from cities, states, and regions. And the slide shows you a brief summary of the number of companies, cities, and other subnational governments that have responded to CDP in 2019. I want to thank Toitū for really organizing this webinar and inviting us today. It's been a real pleasure to be here, especially since we have not been able to make it to New Zealand since the beginning of the year, and unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be much visibility on when we may be able to make it there. COVID has certainly put a spanner in everyone's well-laid plans, hasn't it? And I'm actually struck by how similar the conversations are and continue to dominate. It just kind of continues to dominate or sneak into conversations across the globe, whether you speak with friends or families or colleagues, and no matter what part of the geography you're in, from New York to Melbourne, really. And I think besides the worry and the inconveniences that people have faced with the lockdowns, or in some parts of the world still continue to face, I think the recurring word that we hear is uncertainty. And it's uncertainty with respect to having a job, or uncertainty with finances, uncertainty with cash flows and running your business. And if you come from a poorer country, then it's also uncertainty with finding a hospital bed should you need it. The IMF has termed COVID as a crisis as no other. Projected global growth is expected to be a negative 5% this year, and global trade is expected to contract by 12%. Now, for countries that are still under a lockdown, the primary focus is still very much on healthcare and managing the crisis and providing household support. But for governments that have managed to get this crisis under control, at CDP, we feel these countries are now able to focus on an economic revival that really prioritizes the health of the people, but also of the planet. For many years now, we are well aware of a looming environmental crisis if we continue to live the way we do. And the science has really been unequivocal in this regard. A WWF study recently published, actually I think it was at the beginning of this year, and it demonstrated a link between nature loss and economic impact, establishing that if we continued with business as usual, it has the potential really to cost us about nearly $480 billion a year. And this really just comes from the loss of our natural capital. And this clearly established link between businesses and the nature has really what has spurred civil society organizations and businesses to, in some countries, to come together and tell governments to really start integrating low carbon transition plans in COVID stimulus packages where possible. I think on the optimistic side, and I work for a not-for-profit, so I term myself an eternal optimist in that regard. I think we're more than capable and in a better position today than ever before to manage this climate crisis. For one, the Paris Agreement really brought together countries to announce their low carbon ambitions. But the Paris Agreement also was able to bring a key player in the economic engine to really step up to the climate challenge, and this is the financial sector. And we're starting to see the financial sector across the globe start forming these collaborations, namely on two fronts. So first is really trying to understand the financial impacts of climate change, but secondly, also designing financial products which can then help companies as well as cities in assisting the transition that is required for climate change. You're likely aware of the Network for Greening the Financial System, which was set up in 2017 as a coalition of central banks that have come together to contribute to the development of the environment and climate risk management. There's about 66 central banks today that have come together for this initiative. And they've recently published a set of really interesting publications on climate risk scenario analysis. I'd highly encourage you to read them if you haven't done so already. But this is the first time a central bank coalition has also come to publicly announce that climate change is one of the most significant structural forces that is shaping our global economy today. We've had also sustainability related frameworks that have come together to really assess the financial impacts of climate change. We had the Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, and that was formed specifically for this regard. And I think it's really a step to provide companies, and it's a framework that can be used across to subnational governments as well, in fact, to really get a sense of how to think through your climate strategies. I think besides these sort of cross-border collaborations or even national collaborations that are coming together, what's also really encouraging is that subnational governments are also putting together some of their carbon transition plans, which will enable actors or stakeholders in these cities, if you will, to facilitate a low carbon environment and also enable companies or individuals, for that matter, to really adapt and transition to climate change. We at CDP have been collecting data using the TCFD framework, and we use it in a standardized, we set a set of standardized questions that we send out to companies and their suppliers to respond to. This is a brief statistics of the 2,500 odd companies in Asia Pacific alone that responded to CDP in 2019. And over 2/3 of them identified physical as well as transition risks to their business. So this is something that companies are already reporting upon. I think among the physical risks that you see on the left-hand side of this slide, about 3/4 of them relate to either extreme weather events or the increased severity of these events. And if you look at the transition risks, most companies are anticipating changes in policy and legal, but also with respect to either pricing on greenhouse gas emissions or the regulatory environment, or with respect to increased non-financial reporting. I think one thing to say on this slide as well is that if you break this down even sub-regionally, even if you take the numbers just by the Greater China region, or if you take it by Australia and New Zealand, these figures don't change much. So it's quite apparent that companies across the board, and it's not just one specific country within the Asia Pacific that's facing it more. These numbers are really across the board. What we do is also we ask companies whether they have assessed how these climate risks, but also how these climate opportunities have impacted their business. And as you can see over here, companies are, the red bar in each of these categories really shows the number of companies that are reporting on how climate change has already impacted either their operations or the way they invest in R&D, their products and services, or whether their supply chains are already seeing the impacts of climate change. So these assessments are already beginning to happen at company levels. And one of the other questions that we ask companies is, these climate change risks which have been assessed, how are they being identified within financial planning processes, and whether they are already featuring in financial processes. And this is, we understand that companies have different levels of focus on financial planning within these categories, whether it's be access to capital or with respect to operating costs. But if you see across the board as well, companies are providing, where they have been impacted. And clearly nearly 700 companies today in Asia Pacific have said that this is already impacting their operating costs. What we find is when companies start assessing their climate risks and opportunities, inevitably the financial planning starts to follow. But perhaps the most encouraging statistics that we have had to date is actually the number of companies that have come forward to commit to science-based targets or aligning their business models in line with the Paris Agreement. And 937 companies today have stepped up to this across the world. I think what's really encouraging to note is that despite COVID, this number has been increasing. We've not seen any companies kind of step away from these commitments, or the number of companies that are coming forward is also in an increasing trend. In fact, in Asia, even in emerging economies, we recently validated the targets for a Malaysian company, and we're right now in the process of validating the targets for the first Thai company that wants to commit to realigning its business model. I don't want to paint an entirely rosy picture. However, I think there are persistent gaps in our ambitions. I mean, although all of these enablers from NGFS to the Paris Agreement to all of the sustainability frameworks that are there that exist, there also are certain limitations that we see on the slide. I think number one is, amongst some financial institutions and investors, there continues to be this perceived trade-off that somehow doing good can affect your investment returns. The second sort of biggest trade-off, that limitation that we see, is really just capacity constraints. All of these frameworks and platforms are available, but sometimes companies just aren't able to know where to start or when to start. And then the third, and which I feel is really something that needs to be addressed sooner than later, is the lack of standardization that exists with sustainability frameworks today. I think the first, the perceived trade-off, one of the unexpected sort of upsides of COVID, if you will, for want of a better phrase, we've seen enough data that has come out today showing that this perceived trade-off is unfounded. And namely because the ESG and climate stocks have outperformed in the market with respect to traditional indices. And I've put in a link over here from that you can take a look at leisure, which is from HSBC, JP Morgan, as well as MSCI, that have put forward showing that ESG stocks and climate stocks are performing. These indexes are performing. I think JP Morgan, in fact, has come out to say that the COVID could actually be the tipping point, which will lead to an increasing trend in sustainable investing. The second is, of course, capacity constraints. We are working to address this. I think this is still an area of very much a focus, and TCFD has also acknowledge some of the other sustainability frameworks that are out there in a push to really address this capacity constraints issues. I feel companies will be in a much better place to be responding and to be able to assess and conduct climate scenarios 3 years from now than where they are today. And what we are encouragingly actually seeing is companies coming to us very proactively asking us to host TCFD master classes for their internal staff, specifically the ones that are not sustainability focused. So there's really a push to better understanding these frameworks. So although this constraint exists today, I do think in a large part it will be addressed 2 to 3 years down the line. I think the biggest challenge we still continue to face in many ways is the lack of standardization. I think it's led to a lot of confusion in the market, and I think that's something that continues to persist. There have been certain initiatives or early initiatives that have happened. For example, ourselves with ISO and GRI, along with 2 financial accounting standards, came together to really understand what each of these frameworks and their alignment means with TCFD. And this link that I provided on the slide, and I'm sure Nadine will share that with you at some point, it really sort of gives a really clear snapshot of how each of these frameworks are being aligned with the TCFD. So, companies are better able to understand where and the thought process of the various sustainability frameworks. Standardization is, however, still very much a work in progress amongst various frameworks. I mean, CDP is very aligned with the TCFD, but there's certain areas that we're not aligned with in terms of full sustainability. And if you take other frameworks, for example, GRI, they're very much aligned with the SDGs, but less so with TCFD. And I think that kind of leads to a little bit of a confusion in the market. I hope that that's something that, we formed the Global Reporting Dialogue, which is a coalition of all of these frameworks coming together. So hopefully that's something that will be addressed. My sort of concern with lack of standardization also is that if this issue is not fixed in one way or another, it's really not going to lead to the kind of verification of data that we really need. And verification of data ultimately is really what will push climate finance into coming in and providing that very much needed engine for moving to a low carbon economy. I think I'd just like to wrap up by saying that we are at an inflection point with managing the climate crisis today. We already have all of the tools that are available. I think making reporting and transparency mandatory, especially non-financial, I think will go a long way into meeting some of the challenges that exist today. Transparency of data will be really what is crucial and needed for companies, for financiers, for some national governments, even nations, to ensure that we're actually steering the economies in the right direction. I think if anything that this pandemic has taught us, really, it's really the indomitable human spirit, if you will. I mean, even in the conversations that you have, the typical way we talk is, when we emerge from this crisis, or when a vaccine is found. The conversation is always when, it's not if. And I really hope this optimism that's there will also work towards a post-pandemic world that is synonymous with green recovery. Thank you. I'll now pass it on to Becky for her presentation.
You're off mute.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Some very interesting insights there, and it's lovely to have some optimism to brighten up our day. So I'm going to talk for 10 minutes or so a little bit more about the trends that we're seeing around green recovery and what a green recovery might mean to us here in New Zealand and perhaps around the world as well, and a couple of good examples. And then we'll pass back and we'll have a panel discussion. Okay, so that's my last slide. So let's go back before we go forward, as we get to the right slide, and try and remember what life was like for us back in, this was September 2019. I don't know if any of you were there. I was there, Nadine was there. This was the school strike for climate back in September, which saw over 3% of New Zealand population coming out in force to make our voices heard and to call for climate change action. And it is quite nice, we're in a different period now to look back and remember what that was all about. And that was followed by, in November, the Zero Carbon Bill being passed with a almost 100% majority, which was a huge milestone for New Zealand. And as you all no doubt all know, that set in law our commitments to the Paris Climate Agreement and to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050 and to halve our emissions by 2030. So our goals are clear, consensus is there, public is supportive, and then what happened? Well, it all went a little bit wrong and right in some ways at the same time. So although no one wishes for a pandemic, we did have some really interesting learnings through that period. So this will take you back, I expect, to lockdown level 4. And there were some really tough times, of course. More than 40,000 New Zealanders applied for job seekers support. Small businesses in New Zealand lost on average 34% of their revenue in April, but we also learned a few things about what our planet can do. And many people were enjoying the fresh air and the clear air and the bird song, and the bird song that showed up with a little snapshot of 42% increase in people clicking on the New Zealand Birds Online website to identify the birds that they were seeing on their morning walks and so on. And at that point we were looking forward, well certainly once we came out of level 4, and starting to think about which of those gains we wanted to keep. And there was a really strong narrative at that point around how do we make sure that we build back better, that we have a really good green recovery. And I don't know, hand on heart, whether we're seeing that in the way that we had hoped to at this point, and that's certainly something we can discuss when we move on to the panel conversation. And it's an interesting phenomenon. Why is it that we found it easier to respond to and invest in a health crisis than the global climate change crisis that everybody, I think, probably on this call accept is a bigger issue? And Pratima touched on some of these figures. According to the World Bank, the COVID crisis pandemic will cause a 6% reduction in global GDP. I think Pratima's number was 4.9%, somewhere in that ballpark. Whereas it's well understood that climate change is potentially going to knock 25% off our GDP on a global basis. So it's a significantly more serious issue. What is it in human nature that means we can react to something or respond to something that's hitting us right now, but we find it really hard to make plans and to take action to combat a more steady enemy, if you like. So what do we need to be doing? And there's been some talk that perhaps we weren't warned, we didn't realise that some of these things were coming. This chart's a really interesting one, the World Economic Forum Global Risks List. Alex nodding, you've obviously seen this before. Across the vertical axis, that's the scale of impact, and the horizontal axis is the likelihood. So right up there in the top right-hand corner, high impact, high likelihood is climate action, accompanied by its buddies, extreme weather and biodiversity loss, which I think we're all starting to experience in various parts of the world. The one that's highlighted there with a ring around it is pandemic, and which was seen as a somewhat lower impact and likelihood, but nonetheless that's happened. And even then there's a lot of narrative around, well, why weren't we prepared, why weren't we expecting this? But these risks are well understood and well documented, and so I think it falls to us to take action and do something about it. So let's talk about what that action could and should be. Here's an example that has been recently quite well communicated and documented. So this is what Microsoft is doing, and this is how they're describing their pathway to becoming carbon negative by 2030. And I really like this because, for a number of reasons, because it sets out the various elements of what Microsoft as an organisation needs to do. It sets a really ambitious goal of becoming carbon negative by 2030. And when they're talking about being carbon negative, they're talking about their entire emissions since the company was conceived and started its life. The blue chart here is their full emissions, including their supply chain. So one of the things Microsoft has done is they've not just looked at their direct emissions, the orange blocks, which you will see are considerably smaller than the blue ones, but they've actually had a really good hard look at their upstream and downstream impacts, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. They've then talked about the role of offsetting, avoided emissions offsets, that dark green bar, and that is helping to bridge a gap. Then they've also said, well, in order for us to get where we need to go, we've got to actively get engaged in removals. So they've started investing significant amounts of money in carbon capture and storage, biocapture and so on, which is going to be an essential part of the overall conversation around how we get to net zero by 2050. And the other thing I really like about what Microsoft has done is the 7 principles that they've applied. And those 7 principles are that they are grounding all of this in science and math. I would say maths, they say math, but you get the point. They're taking responsibility for their carbon footprint. And that's, as I said, a carbon footprint, not just of their direct emissions, but the impacts of what they do and what they sell and what their clients and their customers do with their products and services. They are investing heavily in carbon reduction and removal tech because they know they need to. And I think the line that they use is, those of us who can afford to move faster and go further should do so. And I think that should be a bit of a rallying cry for all of us on the call. Another principle they're applying is empowering customers by helping to make it easy for customers to make really good decisions, and being transparent and connecting to Pratima's point. Disclosure is a really important part of being a climate action leader, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on as well. Using their voice for good, so communicating, making it clear what is required to be done, and enlisting and involving their employees in what they're doing. So all of those 7 principles we found to be really effective principles when you want to be a leader in taking climate action. Closer to home, this was in the news last week, slightly controversial and interestingly in the news. So Kiwi Bank announcing that they've committed to no fossil fuel extraction investments ongoing. Not all the political parties were completely in favour of this, but it's important that organisations start to take a stand. And again, this relates to making it easy for customers and investors to make good decisions and make sure that their funds are going to places where they want their funds to be going. And it's raised quite an interesting debate in the New Zealand narrative around whether businesses should be taking positions like this, but I think the consensus has been that it is an appropriate thing for them to do. So let's talk a little bit about what a green recovery means and what's going on elsewhere. So this is some food for thought for us in terms of what the European Union is terming its green recovery and how much they're spending and how much they're investing in the green aspects of their green recovery. So post-COVID, they have committed to a €750 billion recovery plan, which includes greener transport, cleaner industry and renovated homes, and €40 billion being allocated to a just transition fund, because as we're all very aware that transition is possibly the hardest part. It's relatively easy to paint the picture at the end. What's quite difficult is to chart the path that gets us from here to there. And that's particularly around moving away from coal and fossil fuel dependency. All the investments are assessed through a do no harm lens, and 25% of that investment is dedicated to climate policy. So I think that sets a standard for us. I think, in all honesty, we've got a little way to go to get our green recovery plan in New Zealand to be as crisp and ambitious as that, but I think that's something that we all need to be lobbying to do. When you look at what is happening in New Zealand, there has so far been significant amount of investment in green jobs. So budget 2020, 11,000 new green jobs were created to help the environment, which is definitely a good step forward. And $3 billion for shovel-ready projects. What's possibly a little bit disappointing is that some of those shovel-ready projects, it's a term I really hate, but because I think it narrows the definition to traditional infrastructure and digging, and I don't think that's the only place that these green investments can be made. But anyway, let's call them shovel-ready projects. Quite a few of them are grey rather than green, meaning that they are more focused on generating jobs and stimulating the economy. And I think the challenge again for us is how do we make sure that those those investment dollars have co-benefits. So of course, creating jobs is really important, but it can be an and. We can also make sure that we're not locking in permanent high carbon investments. And in fact, that sentiment was shared by Dr. Rod Carr, who is the chair of the Climate Change Commission, in his letter to government urging them not to lock New Zealand into a high emissions pathway. And he set out 6 principles for a green investment, which I recommend that you take a look at, because they're all really good principles to embed in anything that you're doing that may involve significant capital investment. So I would say, we're maybe a B plus. But we've got a way to go. There's $12 billion that are yet to be allocated, and I think what we as a collective want to do is to make sure that those dollars get allocated into areas where they can do multiple forms of good and certainly do no harm. So let's set ourselves that goal to achieve. How has this all played out for Toitū and our clients? Well, we were worried going into lockdown that we would see lots of our clients perhaps being unable to invest the same amount of money in let's be honest, what we do is in the voluntary space. So we were worried that offsets might reduce and clients might fall off carbon zero programs, but pleasingly, that's not something we've seen happening. So what we have seen is that the leaders in this space have stuck to their guns, which we're very grateful. We're continuing actually to see lots more clients come forward and say, we'd really like to work with you and go on this carbon zero journey. So that is good news. We have, of course, seen some sectors of the economy that have not been able to do that. So the tourism sector has had some challenging times and is currently looking at how they can reinvent themselves to cope with what a new normal looks like. But the other thing that we're seeing is a really strong relationship between resilience and having a climate change plan, being active, and this is very consistent with some of the research that Pratima was sharing with us just now. There's a direct correlation between having a good understanding of your risks, having an action plan around climate change and other risks, and then being a resilient business that can weather the storm. And I think that's another reason to get involved in climate action and disclosure, so that you're well placed should more events come along, as I think we have all learned they're going to one way or another. And although the risk matrix gives us some hint of what they might be, no one knows exactly what they will be. The other thing that we're working on at Toitū at the moment, which is relevant to the Microsoft example I spoke about earlier, is the next iteration of the ISO 14064 standard, which is the Carbon Zero Organisation standard. We're working through that through our program at the moment, but the biggest difference between the current version and the new version is the upstream downstream scope 3 emissions. So it sets a higher standard around measuring what the impact of your organisation will be on your clients and your customers, but also on the supply chain that feeds you. And I think that's a shift that we will all be making as we go forward on this carbon zero journey. So that's the end of my section. I just wanted to make one more plug for disclosure, and CDP is as a partner of ours, and it's a very good mechanism for putting together your climate action and sharing it, making it public, a la Microsoft that I was talking about earlier. So I'm going to hand back to Pratima now, and she's going to convene as. Oh, sorry. Now I'm going to hand back to Nadine, and she's going to introduce the next section. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Becky. That was great. We're just going to do a cunning swivel of our technology. You will have just seen, oh, there's my head in the corner. So I'd like to introduce you to our two panellists today. Pratima will be leading our panel and asking some really searching and interesting questions, but again, I encourage you to send your questions through in the chat. There have been a couple come through already, which is fantastic. So sitting on our panel today is Kate Van Praag, the Sustainability Lead of Westpac New Zealand. Thanks for coming in, Kate. And Alec Tang, Chief Sustainability Officer at Auckland Council, sitting here on what I think is the left. It's always difficult to tell. So over to you, Pratima, to start the panel.
Thank you, Nadine. Hi, Alec and Kate. You know, Nadine, Becky, I was just sort of listening to your your speech, and I think the Microsoft one is a great example because they've been long-term supporters of TCFD reporting, and they've as part of this initiative that they've talked about in terms of going carbon neutral or rather carbon negative at some level. Clearly an ambitious plan. It'd be interesting to see how they get there. And they've also been a really strong supply chain member with us. So through the CDP platform, they've been having all of their suppliers respond on their greenhouse gas emissions as well as certain aspects of TCFD. But let me just sort of start with Alec. Thank you for joining us today. I just you recently passed your climate plan this week. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Alec, I don't think we're able to hear you, unfortunately.
Okay. No, it's all good. I was just saying how you can see the bags under my eyes from many late nights recently. So thank you for that. We hit a milestone last week. We've spent 2 years developing a climate plan that meets our commitments to net zero by 2050, but fundamentally halving our emissions in the next 10 years, and also preparing for what could be a 3.5-degree future. So it was fantastic, lots of hard work, lots of engagement, collaboration with Aucklanders as well, and businesses and mana whenua, mātā waka. What I found was really interesting was it was a unanimous decision by council, and in all honesty, post-COVID, we and I was just on a panel with Councillor Richard Hills, who chairs the committee. We weren't sure. We weren't sure what the sentiment might be. We'd just gone through this emergency budget, which stripped back our expenditure as council. But then to have a unanimous decision, to have the support of all the councillors was fantastic. And it's not, it's not the end, but it is the start of what do we do now, because it really is setting the direction. I liken it to like it's a navigation chart. It says this is our profile currently, and this is the scale of change that we need to see over the next 10 years if we are to halve. These are the areas we need to work on, and here are some actions. But fundamentally, we need to fund that action. We need to do that action, and that's kind of the next phase in terms of getting, from council's perspective, our long-term plan, our 10-year investment cycle, but then also working with businesses, working with academia and others to actually do it. Great, really momentous. I spent Wednesday celebrating, and then Wednesday afternoon, the reality of actually doing it started to hit home again. Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's great.
Well, congratulations on seeing it through. We've been working with a couple of NGOs as well with the City of London to have this climate business alliance that we formed once they had their net zero 2050 targets as in place as well, which was really sort of focusing on how can businesses work with the city in meeting the city's targets. It's definitely great to see Auckland also on that journey. You mentioned a little bit about how businesses can also help with some of the city's plans. And Kate, I just wanted to, perhaps before we really jump into questions, it would be great to also understand Westpac, and you've been preparing with your own climate strategy, and how has that sort of, what that is about, and how has that also informed your business strategy and spend?
Thank you, Padma, and te katoa everyone. I just want to say that I hear you first on all of the standards of things. I think Westpac reports against the CDP. We were the first Toitū carbon certified bank. We did GSI, GRI, city CGs, pretty much everything you can get, every indicator we've got it. But I'd say they are, the tricky thing at the moment is they are all valuable, and they're all valuable for different audiences. So I think there will be an ongoing journey for them coming together. And going back to your question, I think, I guess as a bank, we've got quite a unique insight into all parts of the economy. So from, an individual who might have a mortgage and maybe has lost their job or is feeling, financial stress, to small businesses, to much larger businesses, big emitters, and to councils and governments. So I think, knowing information and having good data is really, really important to us, both from our own, I guess, operational strategy. So that's the part that's Carbon Zero certified, and that enables us, I guess, to learn and know and be fully transparent and do our own housework. But then going wider, looking at frameworks like the TCFD, the snappily named TCFD, that really helps us to work with our customers to manage and inform their risks and opportunities, which are then our risks and opportunities. So if we can, you know, look at what is going on, or use our, I guess, own insights to look at national and international trends, questions that are coming from investors, and standards and disclosures and things that all of the central banks of the world are doing and shifting and changing. If we can use those insights to help our customers, that then in turn helps, I guess, New Zealand and the city and the government respond to their climate commitments. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, and just to jump on, in the plan, you know, we have various priorities. One is the economy, and it talks about decarbonising business. And actually, we've gone to the level of saying, yeah, obviously footprint and understand your emissions, but understanding your risks is also critical. And that's the integrated nature of the plan, is to go, well, actually, understanding your climate risks is about understanding business risks. And this makes you a more resilient organisation. So it goes hand in hand.
Absolutely. And to echo Vicky's earlier point about Microsoft's principles, ours are very similar. You know, climate risk is financial risk. So, I mean, I was really pleased, as you know, I think all of us will, during this lockdown, we kind of all thought what's going to happen. Our sustainability strategy at Westpac covers, as a bank, financial wellbeing is also a core pillar in people and communities, but they all oversend. And I think, you know, during that lockdown period, we were particularly obviously being flooded with, you know, people doing it hard immediately and having those hard impacts. But during that time, you know, I was getting emails from people, GMs in the business, saying, how can we use this to increase our agenda? What can we do? Which was really amazing. And then I think what's also come out of that is that intersection of financial well-being and inequality and climate. So, you know, yesterday I heard the interview on Radio New Zealand with Muriwa, you know, really a community that's hit with a lot of flooding, that has not got a lot of income. 50% of those people are not insured. So those are kind of climate and inequality issues intersecting now, which impact individuals, firstly, businesses like us, councils, governments. So they're all kind of coming together, I think, much more clearly since lockdown.
Sorry, President, I know you probably have thought, but this is really interesting because I was just on a panel.
No, go ahead.
A minute ago when we were talking about post-COVID, and I shared this analogy, which some of you might have heard, about the economy being a tanker. And, you know, it's this perpetual machine and it's really hard to stop. But actually what COVID's done is it's stopped that tanker. And so now we have this decision of where we want to turn it and what direction we want to turn it. And a former colleague who has worked with Te Arawhati, the kind of youth Indigenous climate activism group, she kind of called me out, which was great, and said, actually, just to add on to that analogy, we need to change the vessel that we're traveling. We need to rebuild that tanker into something that's different, that's more equitable, that's more distributed, as well as shifting the direction. So it's a really good call that there's a whole bunch of stuff tied in here that we have an opportunity to really think about, you know, where we want to go and how we want to get there. It's are we going to seize that opportunity?
And also who we're bringing along in the journey, right? You know, and I think these are the connections that we need to make, because people need to be at the centre of all of these. You know, data helps us see the picture, but then we kind of need to connect it back to the hearts and minds to really make it deliver.
I think you know, that was sort of my next question, and Alec already touched upon that, but I thought it would be good to get your insights on, you know, this obviously hasn't been an easy time for cities at all, you know, having to deal with the health crisis of these proportions, and then having to deal with, you know, economic, you know, as you put it, you know, stopping the tanker. How you know, just trying to see when you start focusing on economic revival as well, how has your current sort of climate plan strategies, putting that into focus, and how is it really sort of preparing you for an economic revival based on the current stagnation, if you will, for want of a better word, has really resulted in?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. I have to be really honest. Like, so we just passed an emergency budget, as I talked about, for the region, which involved $500 million worth of savings because we've lost revenue. Are the things that have not made it to the budget the right things? I would have shaped, obviously from my perspective, I would have shaped things differently. I think, Becky, to your point, and I was involved in some of that shovel-ready thinking, and it was slightly, it was really draining and slightly depressing to see the same stuff coming back. And what I think it showed me was that and as a council, we set our target, we declared a climate emergency about a year ago, we'd set a halving our emissions by 2030 earlier this year in March, but the thinking hadn't progressed. It was still the same kind of thinking. So there's still a huge amount of work that needs to happen. And obviously, from our perspective, there's a lot of people who are suffering in terms of financially, economically, and we put in interventions to try and do that. What we did find through this process is what actually really matters when we're talking about community resilience. What do people need? And one of the key things we saw and we heard was that access to green space, and from a council perspective, an inequitable coverage in the region. And a lot of people were struggling because they couldn't get out to the places where they wanted to relax and actually down tool. They couldn't do it because it wasn't nearby and they didn't have the area to do it. So we learned a lot about community resilience. We learned a lot about how that's going to be so critical. But we also learned that this is what we don't want to do. We don't. It's almost like the outcomes that we saw. Nature out there singing, living, cleaner streets, people riding around. Kind of the outcomes we want to achieve, but not the way of achieving it. We need a more managed transition. So yeah, it's been tough, and there have been some really difficult calls. I understand those calls. I think it's just a demonstrator of some of the thinking and the decision making hasn't quite caught up with maybe the ambition level that we were setting ourselves.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair to say, and we kind of term it as the ambition gap that currently exists, and it's not an Auckland thing. It's a fairly global, across the board, thing that we really sort of see. I just see that there's about 4 or 5 questions already for us over here today, and Alec, there's a number that's actually directed to you. But before I jump into that, perhaps for Kate, just wanted to also understand, Kate, you mentioned you have a wide variety of clientele, ranging from really large businesses to SMEs to small individuals, and I was just wondering whether you have any instances on how all of your sustainability reporting, which spans from GRI to CDP and some of the others, how that has really sort of helped you work with some of these clients, in also helping them, because they tend to come with far less resources in some cases, into building their own climate strategy plans.
Absolutely, thank you. I think it really fits into Alex's point just before about how you can have a broader strategy and goals, but then how do you join the dots throughout the organisation? And I think those standardised frameworks really help you, especially if you're using something that tells you about risk, like the TCFD, and then also I guess more positive indicators, like GRI and CDP and things like that. And I think probably a good example would be recently we, in 2019, Westpac and Auckland Energy did a sustainability linked loan. And that basically means linking interest of a loan to positive ESG or environmental and social governance outcomes. And it has to be totally legit. So it has to be indicators that are material to that particular business. They get an incentive if they meet those goals, and a disincentive if they don't meet it. And what that does, it really helps an organisation who undertakes something like that talk about it in a real concrete way to different audiences, from their executive and board and investors. And also it gives those indicators meaning, financial meaning. So I think that's probably an example of, obviously there are a larger business, but I think that flows through. So another example is that when we are looking at our own, so not so much our operational footprint, but beyond that, who we lend to or don't lend to, which is where our big impacts are. You know, if we're using, for example, the TCFD framework, that helps inform us about industries or areas that are really high risk, and then we can have conversations with those businesses about how they can, I guess, progress on their own carbon journey, you know, in order to meet big global targets. And then we can either assist them on that journey or make them, it's firstly, I guess, a conversation starter about how it raises awareness, these things coming down the line, what are you doing about it? And then it protects them from risk and also protects us, I guess.
Thanks for that. I think we've, you know, just in the interest of time, probably prudent to just jump straight into some of the other questions that we have. Nadine, I just wanted to check, would you want to run through these questions, or would you want me to?
Yeah, if you can see them, that would be great. Please do. I think the first one is for you anyway, about are there many regions that have mandatory reporting? And then there's a few others which for everyone else.
Yeah, no, I can certainly take that one. So one of the questions that was asked to us was, are there many regions that have mandatory reporting? Some of the regions have started with ESG reporting, not specifically with respect to TCFD. My guess is that would be like the second iteration as they start building these platforms. So, for example, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange has been the mandatory reporting, if you will, is really more on a comply or explain format. So, you know, if you don't respond to or don't provide an ESG report, then you have to explain why you aren't doing so. There are a set of questions that the Hong Kong Stock Exchange also asks, and for this year, they have included climate change in the set of questions that they are requesting companies to respond on. I do know that Singapore has also started it. In quite a few of the geographies, though, it is not yet mandatory, but we do know that it is in the works because there's a lot of
elected members that we're exposed, and there's a whole bunch of regulatory requirements and so on. We have public bond issues as well. We actually play in that financing market. So it's been really good to have had that already. So we haven't had to start in the recent couple of years. We've had that solid foundation that's allowed us to do things like green bonds and allowed us to kind of tap into other markets where we're looking at that distinction or differentiation of our capability. So I think it's been really useful. There's obviously a lot, you know, there. I think the last disclosure there, and this current one that's coming through, there are more questions, there are different questions, and it's always interesting when you get the slightly different takes on, you know, climate risk and what does it actually look like. So that's been good. I think it's still, you know, my earlier point, it's been useful, but we still have this change in mindset, change in prioritization that needs to still happen if we're really going to meet our goals and actually change where we invest Aucklanders' money into things that are actually, you know, green, less grey, or even, you know.
You know, just to add to that, I think, you know, that comes back to the point of connecting the dots, you know. So I guess, you know, there could be something, a TCFD light, I guess, if you like, which would be just disclosing risk. But the TCFD framework actually goes, you know, far beyond reporting, and it uses that, you know, the purpose of reporting is to use that information, use it to inform your strategy, use it to inform policy, how you make decisions, what you do. So it's those, and because it's a new, you know, a reasonably new practice, and lots of new teams and new parts of organisations are learning about how to apply these things, it's going to take a little while. And I guess that's also why it's not super prescriptive, because they want everyone to test it and try it and improve on it. But it's taking that information that we get through these great frameworks and applying it and using it and making it real for the organisation.
And I think the element of an external body kind of asking and then kind of ranking as well, like the disclosure, the nature of disclosure is really good in terms of raising that profile and kind of getting people to ask that question. Just one point I would make, you know, your point, Kate, about flexibility, and it's kind of the converse of standardization. Like, you know, yes, of course, we need standardization to make it easier to assess between, but businesses are so different. And what we found as council is it's hard to apply some of the TCFD stuff because it's like, what's your strategy? Well, is it corporate strategy or strategy for the region? What is it? You know, so you need that flexibility or that understanding that there's a level of comparability that you also want to get.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the same.
Yeah.
When we look at our different industries that we lead to, they'll all have a different strategy. Whether they're agricultural, residential housing, you know, they're all very different. So they'll.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's you know, that was standardization is something that I think we probably need to find a middle ground on at some point. I know the financial community is coming together to see how to address that. And, you know, initially, for example, the green loan principles that were there, which were very cut and dried and sort of really focused on, you know, emissions related or resource efficiency related issues. But now you have the sustainability loan principles, which are, you know, a lot more flexible and, you know, allow a lot more interpretation for a financer to really understand what the underlying sustainability issue is and then to be able to address it as well. So yes, hopefully, you know, going forward, there will be some kind of a middle ground between the lack of standardization, but you know, a step up from there. And then hopefully the financial community also understands the complexity that comes with standardization and sustainability and you know, find a middle ground to help with. I think we might probably have, you know, we've got a couple of questions here, probably one that's also open to Kate and to Alec. I think they asked, what are your thoughts on, you know, central government, local government, or and large organizations that are coming together to invest in carbon technology?
If I just jump in, like, you know, critically, and this is kind of work that I know with outside our circle and just generally climate finance, there's this understanding that we need to blend finance, like private and public capital. We need to think of new instruments and create new instruments that will bring those together. What I would say, and again, innovation is obviously one of those key parts of the climate plan that we have for the region. The question is, in what? And we always talk about innovation, we need more innovation, but from our perspective, we need innovation in the most nutty problems. So for example, like we don't necessarily need, we don't necessarily need innovation in electric vehicles. You know, although we need lots more electric vehicles, the solutions are there. What we actually need as a region is innovation in process heat, because that's actually a really big issue for us. And how do we get industrial heat outside of fossil fuels and all that kind of stuff in those temperature profiles that currently you can't do without electricity. So it's kind of, yes, definitely we need to do it. It's kind of where and can we give direction to people as to where we need that, and you know, what are those problems that we have. And then from our perspective as a city, one of the things I'm also very conscious of is New Zealand's fairly innovative, but often that innovation goes offshore because of the size of the market scale. For Auckland, we have a really interesting opportunity to test city scale innovation. So we're a really nice size, actually. The flip of that is that as a city, we're not massive, but we have some of the problems that other bigger cities have. So can we test some of that here? Can we create those forums that we can actually try and innovate and then export those ideas to other cities?
Yeah, I think that's certainly an idea to test out probably with the climate plan and seeing whether, you know, there are some businesses that would come together for that. I think we have one just sort of one outstanding question, which was, you know, currently whether you, Kate, or Alec, you know, does the New Zealand government or the council, for that matter, provide any incentives with respect to tax to organizations that optionally report their carbon in their annual reports?
No, I would say no, but I would say it's not really about that. To me, the benefit of reporting is really to inform your own organisation and know your own risks, and that will bring benefits beyond a tax relief or whatever. You know, you will know what you're facing into, know where your risks are, become more resilient, and manage them better. And those are all great benefits, I think, of reporting your own emissions externally.
I agree. And I'd say the other thing is, for me, you know, doing nothing isn't standing still. Doing nothing is going backwards in this arena. where like green bond issue, I had this constant talk with our finance team, like, you know, great, we've done green bonds, but my message is actually that's how bonds will be going forward. Like actually outcomes focused lending, investors will want to see where my money's going. So, you know, it sounds like it's innovative, but it's actually just doing the normal that will be in the future. So,
And I think we see this, you know, overseas. The New Zealand market for this kind of thing is lagging, but we get funded by offshore investment. So, you know, these questions aren't way off into the distant future. They're here now. So I think it's really great for all organisations just to be thinking about, you know, what they can do and how they can do it. And the more prepared you are, the better, really.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that people also mistake is that, you know, the TCFD it's not really just a sustainability report. It's actually a business strategy report, which is some of the reasons why, you know, companies or cities sometimes don't get the scoring that they're looking for, because you typically, you know, have, you know, a sustainability team writing that, and it's not feeding into the board of directors who should be really understanding what the strategy is about. And I guess once they start working on this, they'll realize, you know, how important it is, and that you don't really need incentives for it. You could just get the journey started. Thank you for this. This has been really insightful and helpful. And you know, Alec and Kate, it's been great talking to you.
no problem.
Thank you,
Great
Pratima. Great talking to you as well.
Just me again, just thank you to all, to Pratima, Becky, Alec and Kate. That was a really fantastic discussion, and one I think will be interesting to keep going as we continue through the COVID experience and see what the next 6 months brings. Unpredictable at best, I'm sure. Just a quick reminder that we will be emailing out the recording in the next couple of days, so keep an eye out in your inbox for that. And if you do have any questions or have any follow-up, please don't hesitate to get in touch. But thanks again for being part of our webinar today, and wishing you a wonderful Wednesday. Thank you.